The television cast everything in blue-white flickers, washing the living room in that familiar glow I'd grown used to over countless Friday nights. The sound of gunfire echoed from the speakers, digital chaos that had become our soundtrack, mine and Adrian's, the way other people had dinner music or background jazz. My thumbs worked the controller with practiced precision, navigating through another firefight, another mission that meant nothing beyond the few hours it could steal from real life. Adrian sat beside me on the couch, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with something else. Maybe the rain he'd walked through to get here. Maybe just the particular warmth that belonged to him alone. We'd been playing for 2 hours, maybe 3. Time moved differently in that room, suspended between the soft cushions and the drone of air conditioning, measured only in respawn timers and the occasional curse when one of us missed a shot. Then he laughed. It started as a chuckle at something ridiculous happening on screen. His character had just been eliminated by what looked like a 12-year-old with impossible reflexes. The laugh grew, that deep, unguarded sound that I'd been hearing since we were kids, since we used to stay up too late talking about everything and nothing. But this time, as the laughter overtook him, he leaned back against the couch, his whole body relaxing in a way that seemed to pull gravity itself toward him. And somehow, without thought, without intention, he settled into my lap. It happened so naturally that for a moment neither of us acknowledged it. His weight shifted against me, solid and warm, his back pressing against my chest as if this was something we'd done 1,000 times before. The controller in my hands suddenly felt foreign, the buttons meaningless. The game continued on the screen, soldiers running and dying in loops I no longer cared to follow. The world outside that room, the rain still tapping against the windows, the distant hum of traffic, the responsibilities waiting in other rooms of my house, all of it collapsed into nothing. There was only the steady rise and fall of his breathing, the way his hair looked in the television's glow, the impossible fact of his presence in a space that had never held anyone but myself. My heart began to hammer against my ribs with a rhythm that felt dangerous, like it might give away some secret I hadn't even known I was keeping. Every nerve in my body had suddenly awakened to his closeness, to the weight of his shoulder blades against my chest, to the way his laughter was fading into something quieter, more thoughtful. I could feel the heat of him through his shirt, could sense the slight tension in his muscles as if he too had become aware of what was happening between us. I gripped the controller tighter, knuckles white, pretending that my focus was still on the screen, pretending that my breathing hadn't changed, that my pulse hadn't quickened, that everything I thought I knew about our friendship hadn't just shifted into something else entirely. Something I didn't have words for, something I wasn't sure I wanted to name. The silence stretched between us, thick with possibility and danger. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. On the screen, my character stood motionless in the middle of a battlefield, an easy target for anyone who cared to take the shot. But I couldn't make my thumbs work, couldn't force myself to care about winning or losing when something far more important was happening in the space between heartbeats. Adrian still hadn't moved. His breathing had grown quieter, more deliberate, as if he too was trying to decode what was happening in this moment that had started as an accident, as nothing more than comfortable laughter between old friends. But accidents don't make your chest tighten like this. Accidents don't make you suddenly aware of every point where another person's body meets your own. I forced myself to smile, though he couldn't see it. Forced myself to make some comment about his terrible gaming skills, something light and familiar that might restore the safe distance we'd always maintained. But even as I spoke, even as I tried to pull us back to solid ground, I could feel it, the ordinary fabric of our friendship, that comfortable thing we'd worn for decades, beginning to tear along seams I hadn't even known existed. The moment stretched on, suspended in that blue-white glow, long after I finally managed to move my character again, long after the game resumed its familiar rhythms of violence and victory. Something had changed, something that could never be unchanged, and we both knew it even as we pretended otherwise. When he finally did shift, finally moved back to his own space on the couch, the absence of his weight felt like a physical loss, like stepping from warmth into cold. But the awareness lingered, sharp and undeniable, a new current running beneath everything we said and did for the rest of the evening. I kept playing, kept making the right sounds at the right moments, kept being the person I'd always been in his presence. But underneath it all, something was awakening that I wasn't sure I was brave enough to face. I've spent most of my 33 years learning how to be the right kind of man. The kind who wakes at 6:15 without an alarm, who straightens his tie in the hallway mirror before kissing his wife goodbye, who drives the same route to work every morning while listening to news that somehow never changes. The fluorescent lights in my office building have been humming the same flat note for 7 years now, washing everything in that particular shade of nothing that makes the hours bleed together into weeks, months, an entire decade of measured breathing. My desk sits in the third row from the window, close enough to see the parking lot, but far enough that I can't make out individual cars. I process insurance claims with the kind of methodical precision that supervisors notice and promote. I wear ties that Evelyn picks out for me, blues and grays that she says bring out my eyes, though I've never been sure what color my eyes actually are. In the bathroom mirror at work, under those lights, they look like water. Evelyn has been my wife for 11 years. We met in college, in a literature class where she sat 2 seats ahead of me and always had the right answer when the professor asked about symbolism. She has a way of organizing life into neat categories, bills in one folder, warranties in another, our son's school papers arranged by grade and subject. When she laughs, which she does often, it sounds like music someone composed specifically for dinner parties. She makes our house feel like the kind of place where normal people live normal lives. Our son is 14 now, growing into the kind of distance that teenagers wear like armor. He used to climb into my lap during movies, used to ask me to read him stories about dragons and knights. Now he nods when I ask about school, shrugs when I suggest we throw a baseball in the backyard. His world has doors I'm not invited through, and I find myself oddly grateful for his absence. It's easier than trying to explain why I sometimes stare at him across the dinner table and wonder what kind of man I'm teaching him to become. The house we live in has 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, and a kitchen island where Evelyn arranges fruit in bowls that no one ever empties. Every wall holds a photograph of us smiling. Vacation pictures from places we went because other couples go there, holiday shots where we're wearing sweaters that match just enough to look intentional. In the hallway between the living room and the kitchen, there's a picture of me from our wedding day. I'm looking at the camera instead of at Evelyn, and my smile looks like something I borrowed from someone else. This is the life I built, brick by careful brick, decision by reasonable decision. I chose Evelyn because she was kind and smart, and because loving her felt like the right thing to do. I chose the house because it was in a good school district, and because the mortgage payment fit neatly into our budget. I chose my job because it offered health insurance and 2 weeks of vacation, and because the work was predictable enough that I could do it without thinking. For years, I thought this was what happiness looked like. I thought the quiet satisfaction of routine, the comfort of knowing exactly what each day would bring, was what people meant when they talked about having a good life. I mowed the lawn on Saturdays, helped with homework on weekday evenings, made love to my wife in the dark on Sunday nights with a tenderness that felt real enough. But Adrian never chose any of it. We grew up 3 houses apart on Elm Street, spent our summers building forts in the woods behind his backyard, our winters huddled over video games in his basement. Even as kids, he had this quality of never quite settling, never quite fitting into the shapes that adults wanted to draw around him. While I was learning to raise my hand before speaking, Adrian was climbing trees during recess. While I was memorizing multiplication tables, he was asking questions that made teachers uncomfortable, not about math, but about why we needed to learn math, why we sat in rows, why we couldn't go outside when the weather was perfect. He never married, never bought a house with a mortgage that tethers you to the same job for decades. He rents apartments in different parts of the city, stays until the lease runs out, then finds somewhere new. He works when he needs money, construction jobs, bartending, sometimes driving for one of those apps that turns your car into a taxi. He's never owned a tie, never learned to make conversation at dinner parties or remember which fork to use for salad. When he shows up at my house on Friday evenings, dropping by like we're still 15 and summer vacation stretches endlessly ahead of us, he brings something with him that I'd forgotten existed. The possibility that life doesn't have to be a series of responsible choices, that sometimes you can just do things because they feel right in the moment. Evelyn likes him well enough. She remembers him from when we were young, sees him as harmless nostalgia, a reminder of who I used to be before I learned to be who I am now. She sets an extra place at dinner when he stays late, laughs at his stories about the eccentric customers at whatever bar he's working at this month. She doesn't see what I see when he walks into our carefully organized life. The way the air changes, becomes charged with possibility. After that night on the couch, after the weight of him in my lap, and the way my heart hammered against secrets I didn't know I was keeping, I started noticing things I trained myself not to see. The way I hold my breath when his car pulls into the driveway. The way I find excuses to text him during the day, questions about weekend plans that could wait, links to articles I think he might find interesting. The way I've started looking forward to Friday nights with an intensity that feels dangerous. I've spent so many years perfecting the performance of being Caleb, husband, father, reliable employee, that sometimes I forget it's a performance at all. Until Adrian settles into my lap, until his laughter fades into silence, and I remember what it feels like to want something I'm not supposed to want. Until I realize that the life I've built so carefully might be the very thing that's been killing me, one responsible decision at a time. The fluorescent lights hum their flat note. Evelyn arranges fruit in bowls. Our son grows more distant each day. And somewhere in the space between who I am and who I might have been, Adrian exists like a door I've been afraid to open, afraid even to acknowledge is there. The visits started innocently enough. Adrian began showing up on weeknight evenings, not just Fridays, carrying a backpack and wearing the kind of easy smile that made it impossible to question his presence. He told Evelyn he was helping our son with a history project, something about the Cold War that required research Adrian claimed to know something about. I never asked him what he actually knew about geopolitics. I was too grateful for the excuse. He would spread papers across our dining room table, notebooks and printed articles that looked official enough to satisfy Evelyn's need for our son to take his education seriously. They would work for an hour, maybe two, Adrian asking questions that somehow made the Berlin Wall and nuclear deterrence sound like adventures rather than the dry facts I remembered from my own high school years. My son actually laughed during these sessions, a sound that had become rare enough in our house that Evelyn and I would catch each other's eyes across the room, surprised by the novelty of it. But I knew the history project was just a door, a way for Adrian to enter our carefully structured evenings, to sit at our table and eat Evelyn's reheated casseroles and gradually become part of the rhythm we'd established over years of measured routine. When the project ended, my son earned an A, something he announced with more pride than I'd seen from him in months. Adrian kept coming anyway. Now he would arrive with takeout containers, claiming he'd ordered too much food and didn't want it to go to waste. Or he'd bring a new video game he thought I might want to try, something he'd picked up at a used electronics store. The excuses grew thinner, but Evelyn never seemed to mind. To her, Adrian was harmless nostalgia, a reminder of simpler times when her husband had friends who dropped by unannounced and brought laughter with them. She couldn't see what I saw, the way Adrian's eyes would find mine across the dinner table, holding my gaze just a moment longer than friendship required. The way he would brush against me in the kitchen when we were cleaning up, his shoulder touching mine in a space that was easily wide enough for both of us. The way he seemed to know exactly when Evelyn would be distracted by a phone call or our son's need for help with something, creating pockets of time when it was just the two of us, standing too close, speaking too quietly. I started looking forward to these visits with an intensity that frightened me. I would find myself checking my phone throughout the day, hoping for a text from him. I would drive home from work with my heart beating faster than traffic warranted, wondering if his car would be in our driveway. When he didn't come, the evening felt hollow, like a song missing its melody. 3 weeks after that night on the couch, Adrian invited me to his apartment. He made it sound casual, almost an afterthought. A few old friends were coming over on Saturday night. People we'd known in high school who were still in town, still unmarried or divorced enough to spend their weekends playing video games and eating pizza straight from the box. He mentioned it while helping me carry dishes to the kitchen after dinner, his voice so matter-of-fact that Evelyn barely looked up from the homework she was checking. But for me, the invitation felt like a fracture in the world. I hadn't been to Adrian's place in years, not since before I got married. Before I learned that husbands who want to stay married don't spend Saturday nights at their bachelor friends' apartments. The thought of entering his space again, of seeing how he lived when no one was watching, sent something electric through my chest that I couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. Evelyn encouraged me to go. She said it would be good for me to spend time with friends, that I'd been working too hard lately and needed to relax. She offered to take our son to her mother's house, make a whole evening of it. The ease with which she arranged my freedom made me feel both grateful and guilty in ways I couldn't untangle. Saturday night arrived with the weight of inevitability. I stood in front of my closet for too long, changing shirts twice before settling on something casual enough to fit in, but nice enough to suggest I'd made an effort. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw a man preparing for something he couldn't name, something that felt both terrifying and necessary. Adrian's apartment occupied the second floor of an old Victorian house that had been converted into units decades ago. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed to his door, carrying a six-pack of beer that suddenly felt inadequate, like bringing flowers to a funeral. When he opened the door, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that had faded to the perfect shade of comfortable, I felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized was wound tight. Inside, the apartment looked exactly like Adrian. Organized chaos, lived in comfort, walls covered with movie posters and photographs from trips I'd never heard him talk about. The couch had seen better decades, but invited you to sink into it anyway. Books were stacked on surfaces that weren't meant to hold books. The whole place smelled like coffee and something else I couldn't identify. Maybe just the particular scent of a life lived without apology. The evening unfolded exactly as he'd promised. Old friends arrived carrying pizza boxes and cases of beer, filling the small space with the kind of easy laughter that comes from people who've known each other long enough to skip the careful small talk. We played games, some on the television, some with cards that appeared from a drawer in the kitchen table. We told stories about people we'd known in high school, updated each other on marriages and divorces and career changes that had happened while we weren't paying attention. For 3 hours, I felt like a younger version of myself. Not the teenager I'd actually been, anxious and eager to please, but the person I might have been if I'd been brave enough to want things without calculating their cost first. I laughed until my sides hurt. I argued about which movie sequel was the worst ever made. I ate pizza that dripped grease onto my shirt and didn't care enough to change it. But as the evening wound down, as friends began making excuses about early mornings and long drives home, I felt something shifting in the room's atmosphere. The laughter grew quieter, more intimate. The space between Adrian and me on the couch seemed to shrink without either of us moving. When the last friend left, calling goodbye from the stairwell, the apartment suddenly felt enormous and tiny at the same time. Adrian stood to clear the empty pizza boxes, moving with the unconscious grace that had always been part of him. He asked if I wanted to stay a little longer, maybe play a game or two like we used to. His voice was casual, but there was something underneath it, a current I could feel but couldn't name. When I said yes, the word came out rougher than I'd intended. We settled back onto the couch, controllers in our hands, the television casting that familiar blue-white glow across both of us. But this time felt different from all those Friday nights at my house. Here, in his space, surrounded by the evidence of the life he'd chosen, the freedom, the possibility, the refusal to settle into the shapes other people wanted to draw around him, I felt more awake than I had in years. We sat closer than we needed to. Our shoulders brushed when we leaned forward during intense moments in the game. When Adrian made a joke about my terrible aim, his voice carried a teasing quality that felt like flirtation, like a door being cracked open just wide enough to peer through. I laughed too quickly, too loudly, my nervousness betraying me in ways I hoped he wouldn't notice. But Adrian noticed everything. He always had. And in the quiet that settled between us after my awkward laughter died away, I felt that same invisible weight from 3 weeks ago descending on the room, thick and charged and impossible to ignore. This pull toward him that I'd been trying to disguise as nostalgia, as the simple pleasure of rekindled friendship, had sharpened into something far more dangerous. Something that felt inevitable, even as every rational part of me insisted it was impossible. After that Saturday night, something inside me had awakened that refused to go back to sleep. I found myself inventing reasons to drive past Adrian's neighborhood, telling myself I was taking a new route home from work, exploring parts of the city I'd forgotten existed. Sometimes I would see his car parked outside the Victorian house and feel my pulse quicken with the knowledge that he was there, just 2 flights of stairs away, living his unguarded life. I started texting him more often, not just about weekend plans, but about smaller things, a song I'd heard on the radio that reminded me of our high school years, a news article about a movie we'd talked about, questions about whether he wanted to grab lunch on a Saturday afternoon. He always responded quickly, enthusiastically, as if he'd been waiting for an excuse to talk to me too. The lunch meetings became regular occurrences. We would meet at diners with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that had been brewing too long, places where no one we knew would think to look for us. These weren't the kind of restaurants I went to with Evelyn. She preferred places with cloth napkins and servers who introduced themselves by name. But sitting across from Adrian in a booth held together with duct tape, eating hamburgers that dripped onto paper plates, I felt more like myself than I had in years. Our conversations during these lunches began to shift into territory we'd never explored before. Adrian asked questions that cut through the polite surface of catch-up talk, questions that seemed designed to excavate something I'd buried beneath years of responsible living. "Are you happy?" he asked one afternoon, his voice casual but his eyes serious. "Really happy, I mean. Not satisfied or content or grateful for what you have." "Happy." I told him I was, of course. I had everything I was supposed to want: a stable job, a good marriage, a son who was healthy and smart. I had a house with a 2-car garage and a retirement account that was growing steadily. I volunteered for community events and remembered birthdays and had never cheated on my taxes. What more could a person want? But Adrian wasn't satisfied with that answer. He had this way of listening that made it impossible to hide behind the scripts I'd memorized for these kinds of conversations. "Do you ever think about how things could have been different?" he asked. "If you'd made different choices, chosen different paths. Do you ever wonder about the version of yourself that might have existed?" I did wonder. Late at night, staring at the ceiling while Evelyn slept beside me, I wondered about alternate versions of my life with an intensity that frightened me. But I'd never said it out loud before, never admitted that the solid foundation of my existence sometimes felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. These lunch conversations followed me home, echoing in my mind as I sat at the dinner table listening to Evelyn talk about her day at the library where she worked part-time, cataloging books and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer system. She would tell me about problem patrons and budget meetings and the new young adult section they were planning, and I would nod and ask appropriate questions while thinking about Adrian's hands wrapped around a coffee cup, the way he'd leaned across the table when he asked me about happiness. The Friday night gaming sessions at my house continued, but they had taken on a different quality. What had once felt like harmless nostalgia now thrummed with undercurrents I couldn't ignore. We sat closer together on the couch than we needed to, our knees occasionally bumping, our hands brushing when we both reached for snacks from the coffee table. These accidental touches lasted longer than they should have, neither of us pulling away as quickly as friendship required. The silences between us grew thick with unspoken words. During loading screens and cut scenes, when the room fell quiet except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of Evelyn cleaning up in the kitchen, Adrian and I would find ourselves looking at each other instead of the television. These glances held weight, carried meanings I wasn't ready to name but couldn't pretend not to feel. I began to notice things about him that I'd somehow missed during all our years of friendship. The way his jaw tightened when he was concentrating on a difficult section of a game. The small scar on his left hand from when he'd tried to build a treehouse when we were 12 and the hammer had slipped. The way he laughed, not just with his voice, but with his whole body, shoulders shaking, head thrown back. How had I gone so long without really seeing him? Evelyn started watching me with a different kind of attention. Not suspicion exactly, but a puzzled awareness that something in our household dynamic had shifted. She would find me staring into space during dinner, would have to repeat questions I hadn't heard the first time. She noticed that I'd started working later at the office, coming home with apologies about projects that needed finishing, deadlines that couldn't be moved. The truth was I wasn't working late. I was driving around the city, sometimes stopping at parks where I would sit in my car and try to understand what was happening to me. Other times I would end up at bookstores or coffee shops, places where I could be alone with thoughts I couldn't have at home. I was buying myself time, delaying the moment when I would have to walk through my front door and pretend to be the person I'd always been. One evening in late October, when the air had turned crisp and the leaves were beginning their slow surrender to winter, Adrian showed up at my house carrying a bottle of red wine. He said he'd been given it as a tip from a customer at the restaurant where he'd been working, something expensive that seemed too good to drink alone. Evelyn was at a book club meeting. Our son was at a friend's house working on yet another school project. The house felt larger than usual in their absence, more echoey. We opened the wine and settled into our usual spots on the couch, controllers in hand. But the game became secondary to the conversation that flowed as easily as the wine between us. Adrian talked about places he wanted to travel, countries he'd seen in movies and imagined visiting. He described waking up in a different city, knowing nobody, having no obligations except to figure out where to get good coffee and how to say thank you in the local language. The wine made me braver than I should have been. I found myself telling him about dreams I'd forgotten I'd ever had, about writing stories, about learning to play guitar, about living somewhere near the ocean where I could hear waves instead of traffic. These weren't things I'd ever shared with Evelyn, weren't even things I'd admitted to myself in years. As the evening wore on and the bottle grew lighter, our conversation grew more intimate, more honest. Adrian talked about loneliness, about the freedom of his lifestyle and the cost that came with it. I talked about the weight of responsibility, about loving my family and feeling trapped by that love at the same time. We were tiptoeing around something neither of us was ready to name, circling closer to a truth that felt both inevitable and impossible. When the wine was gone, when our words had grown softer and our laughter quieter, Adrian shifted on the couch. He had been sitting upright, maintaining the careful distance that friendship required, but now he let himself relax, let his body fold into a more comfortable position. His head found its way to my shoulder, settling there as naturally as if it had always belonged there. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. I could feel the weight of his head against my shoulder, the warmth of his body along my side, the steady rhythm of his breathing. My heart was hammering so loudly I was certain he could hear it, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't pull away. This moment felt like something I'd been waiting for my entire life without knowing it. The television flickered through its screensaver, casting changing patterns of light across the wall. The house creaked around us in its familiar way, settling into the quiet of evening. And still Adrian's head remained on my shoulder. Still I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had descended on us. When he finally did lift his head, when he straightened up and reached for his jacket, claiming he should get home before the wine made driving dangerous, the absence of his weight felt like a physical loss. The air where he had been felt cold, empty. But something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be unshifted, and we both knew it even as we said our careful goodnights. After he left, I sat alone on the couch for another hour, touching the spot on my shoulder where his head had rested, trying to memorize the feeling. When Evelyn came home from her book club, full of opinions about the month's selection and gossip about which members had liked it and which hadn't, I nodded and made appropriate responses while part of me remained on that couch. In that moment, with Adrian's head on my shoulder and my heart beating out the rhythm of something I was finally ready to name. That night, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and thought about the weight of his head, the sound of his breathing, The way my entire body had felt awake in a way I couldn't remember experiencing before. I thought about happiness, real happiness, and for the first time in years, I thought I might know what it actually felt like. The weeks following that evening with the wine moved differently than time usually moved in my carefully ordered life. Each day felt stretched thin, hyper-aware, as if the air itself had changed composition. I found myself paying attention to details I'd never noticed before. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table, the particular sound Evelyn's coffee mug made when she set it down, the rhythm of my son's footsteps on the stairs. Everything felt heightened, significant, as if I were seeing my own life from the outside and finding it both precious and suffocating. Adrian and I continued our Friday night routines, but the easy familiarity we'd maintained for decades had been replaced by something electric and uncertain. We were more careful with each other now, more aware of the spaces between us, the weight of accidental touches, the way silence could fill with meaning neither of us was ready to voice. When he laughed, I found myself studying his face. When I spoke, I caught him watching my mouth form words. 3 weeks after the wine, after his head on my shoulder and the sleepless night that followed, we were deep into a game that required more concentration than usual. Some complicated strategy thing Adrian had brought over, full of multiple objectives and split-second decisions. The television screen was crowded with maps and menus, demanding the kind of focus that usually made conversation impossible. But I wasn't focusing on the game. I was focusing on Adrian beside me, the way he leaned forward during intense moments, the small sounds of frustration he made when his character died, the unconscious way he bit his lower lip when he was thinking. I'd been pretending to pay attention to the screen while really paying attention to him, and it was showing in my terrible performance. He paused the game during a particularly difficult section, reaching forward to grab his water bottle from the coffee table. It was a simple movement, the kind of thing that happened dozens of times during our gaming sessions. But instead of just reaching across the space in front of him, he reached across me, his body moving into my personal space in a way that felt deliberate, intentional. His hand found mine instead of the water bottle. Neither of us moved. Neither of us pulled away. His palm was warm against my knuckles, his fingers settling against mine with a naturalness that should have been impossible. The game remained frozen on the screen, waiting for us to unpause it, but the only sound in the room was our breathing, suddenly loud and uneven. I looked down at our hands, his slightly larger than mine, more calloused from whatever construction job he was working now, but fitting against mine as if they'd been designed for exactly this moment. When I looked up, he was watching my face with an expression I'd never seen before, something between hope and terror. The moment stretched between us, heavy with possibility and danger. Every rational part of my mind was screaming warnings about my marriage, my son, the life I'd built so carefully over so many years. But there was another voice underneath the rational one, quieter but more insistent, telling me that this moment had been waiting for us for decades, that we'd been moving toward it through all those years of friendship and all those careful distances we'd maintained. Adrian leaned closer, not quickly, not suddenly, but with the slow inevitability of something that had already been decided by forces larger than both of us. His breath was warm against my cheek, carrying the faint scent of mint gum and something else that was just him, just Adrian, just this person who had somehow become the center of gravity in my carefully balanced world. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Are you sure you want to keep pretending this isn't happening? The question hung in the air between us, impossible to answer and impossible to ignore. Because he was right. I had been pretending, for weeks now, maybe for years. Pretending that the way I felt around him was just friendship, just nostalgia, just the comfort of knowing someone who remembered who I used to be. Pretending that my marriage was enough, that my life was complete, that the restlessness that kept me awake at night was just midlife anxiety and not something deeper, more fundamental. Instead of answering with words, I turned my face toward his. The movement was so small it barely qualified as movement at all, just a shift in angle that brought us closer, that closed the last few inches of space between us. I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count his eyelashes if I wanted to, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. When our lips met, it felt like recognition rather than discovery, like something I'd been waiting for my entire life without knowing I was waiting. The kiss was hesitant at first, trembling, both of us uncertain about this territory we'd never explored together. But underneath the uncertainty was a rightness that I felt in every cell of my body, a sense of coming home to a place I hadn't known existed. His lips were softer than I'd imagined, and I realized with a shock that I had been wondering about this moment during those sleepless nights when I stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening to me. The kiss deepened, became more certain, as if we were both learning a language we'd always known how to speak. Then reality crashed back into me like cold water. I pulled away so quickly that Adrian's eyes flew open in surprise. The distance between us, which moments before had felt like nothing, now felt enormous and insufficient at the same time. My heart was hammering against my ribs with a rhythm that felt dangerous, like it might give me away even across the room. The taste of him lingered on my lips, evidence of what had just happened, proof that I'd crossed a line I could never uncross. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. The words tumbled out of me in a rush of panic and confusion. "I shouldn't have. We can't. This isn't." But Adrian was watching me with that same careful attention he'd always had, seeing through the scrambled words to the truth underneath. His expression was patient, understanding, as if he'd been expecting this reaction, as if he knew me better than I knew myself. "Caleb," he said quietly, "it's okay." But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. I was a married man, a father, someone who had built a life based on certain assumptions about who I was and what I wanted. I had responsibilities, obligations, a mortgage and a retirement plan, and a wife who trusted me to be the person I'd promised to be on our wedding day. "I can't," I said, standing up from the couch, needing distance, needing space to think clearly. "This can't happen again. It was a mistake." Even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. A mistake was something accidental, something you didn't mean to do. But I had meant to turn my face toward his. I had wanted that kiss with an intensity that frightened me. And underneath all the panic and guilt and rational arguments about why this was impossible, I wanted it to happen again. Adrian stood up too, but he didn't move closer. He just watched me with those patient eyes, waiting for me to finish saying things we both knew I didn't mean. When I finally stopped talking, when the stream of panicked explanations and apologies ran dry, he nodded once, slowly. "I understand," he said. "But Caleb..." He paused, seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "You know this doesn't just go away, right? What just happened, what's been building between us for weeks now, it's not something you can decide to ignore. I've tried ignoring it. I've been trying for years." The admission hit me like a physical blow. Years. He'd been feeling this for years, had been carrying it around while I played the devoted husband, while I convinced myself that our friendship was just friendship, that the way I felt around him was normal and harmless and nothing more than nostalgia. For the first time in decades, I knew exactly who I was. Not the role I'd been playing, not the person I'd trained myself to be, but the real me, the one who had been hiding underneath years of careful choices and responsible living. The one who wanted Adrian with a desperation that made everything else in my life feel like an elaborate performance. But knowing who I was and knowing what to do about it were entirely different things. I stood there in my living room, in the house I'd bought with my wife, surrounded by the evidence of the life I'd built so carefully, and felt the foundation of everything I thought I knew about myself cracking apart beneath my feet. The days following the kiss moved like a fever dream, each hour stretching into impossible lengths, while entire days disappeared without leaving any trace in my memory. I would find myself standing in my kitchen at 7 in the morning with no recollection of getting dressed or making coffee, staring at the steam rising from my mug, as if it might contain answers to questions I was afraid to ask. Work became a refuge and a torment. The familiar routine of processing claims and attending meetings offered brief escapes from the chaos in my head, but even there I couldn't find peace. I would catch myself touching my lips during conference calls, remembering the softness of Adrian's mouth against mine, the way he'd tasted like mint and possibility. Colleagues began asking if I was feeling well. I told them I wasn't sleeping much, which was true enough to satisfy their curiosity. At home, I became a ghost haunting my own life. I sat at the dinner table and nodded at appropriate moments while Evelyn talked about her day at the library, but I couldn't have repeated a single thing she said. My son would ask for help with homework, and I would stare at the equations or essay prompts as if they were written in a foreign language, my mind too fractured to focus on anything beyond the memory of Adrian's hand in mine. Evelyn noticed, of course. She began watching me with the careful attention of someone trying to diagnose a problem she couldn't name. She would ask if I was feeling sick, if work was stressing me out, if there was anything she could do to help. Her concern was genuine, loving, and it made my guilt so sharp I could barely breathe around it. I started working later, or pretending to work later. Instead of coming home at my usual time, I would drive aimlessly through the city, ending up in parking lots of stores I had no intention of entering, sitting in my car and trying to understand what was happening to me. Sometimes I would find myself near Adrian's neighborhood and have to force myself to drive away before I did something irreversible. The text messages between us had stopped entirely after that night. Neither of us seemed to know what to say, how to navigate this new territory we'd stumbled into. The silence between us felt loaded, dangerous, like the moment before lightning strikes when the air itself seems to hold its breath. 2 weeks after the kiss, Evelyn confronted me directly. We were lying in bed, the room dark except for the green glow of the alarm clock, when she turned toward me with the rustle of sheets and the weight of questions she'd been carrying. "Caleb," she said softly, "what's wrong?" I told her nothing was wrong, the same lie I'd been perfecting for weeks. "Just tired," I said. "Work has been demanding lately." But Evelyn had been my wife for 11 years. She knew the difference between tired and whatever this was. "You've been different," she said. "Distant. You barely talk to me anymore, barely look at me. You come home late, every night with excuses that don't make sense. When I touch you, you pull away like I've burned you." She was right about all of it. I had been pulling away, not just physically but emotionally, creating distance to protect both of us from the truth I was carrying. But hearing her say it out loud made the reality of what I was doing to her, to our marriage, impossible to ignore. "Are you having an affair?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the darkness between us. I could have said no and meant it, technically. I could have told her that nothing physical had happened beyond a single kiss, that I had never betrayed our marriage vows in any concrete way. But the technical truth felt like a bigger lie than anything I could have said. "I'm not having an affair," I said finally, which was true and completely inadequate at the same time. "Then what?" she asked. "Because something is happening, Caleb. Something has changed, and I need to know what it is." I wanted to tell her everything. Part of me wanted to confess it all, the feelings I'd been having, the confusion that kept me awake at night, the way I'd been questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. But how do you tell the person who has built their life around loving you that you might not be the person they think you love? Instead, I told her I was just going through something, that I needed some time to figure things out. The vagueness of it frustrated her. I could tell, but she didn't push further. Not that night. A week later, she asked me a different question, one that cut straight to the heart of everything I'd been avoiding. We were in the kitchen after dinner, cleaning up in the comfortable silence that had once defined our partnership. But now the silence felt heavy, loaded with unspoken tensions. Our son had gone upstairs to his room, leaving us alone with the echo of normal family life and the weight of all the things we weren't saying to each other. "Do you love me?" she asked suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. I stopped washing dishes, my hands frozen in the soapy water. It should have been the easiest question in the world to answer. I should have been able to say yes without hesitation, should have been able to turn around and reassure her that whatever was happening with me had nothing to do with my feelings for her. But I couldn't make the word come out of my mouth. Because the truth was more complicated than yes or no. I did love her, in the way you love someone who has been good to you. who has shared your life and helped you build something stable and meaningful. I loved her history, her kindness, her dedication to our family. But standing there in our kitchen, unable to answer the simplest question a husband should be able to answer, I realized that loving someone and being in love with them were not the same thing at all. "Caleb?" she said, and I could hear the fear in her voice. "Yes," I said finally, but it came out wrong, uncertain, like a question rather than an answer. She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face for something she couldn't find. Then she turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing alone with my hands in dirty dishwater and the terrible knowledge that my hesitation had already given her the real answer. That night, I couldn't stand being in the house anymore. After Evelyn had gone to bed and our son had settled into his room for the night, I got in my car and drove to Adrian's apartment. I didn't text him first, didn't call to see if he was home. I just drove through the dark streets with my heart hammering and my hands shaking on the steering wheel, knowing only that I needed to see him, needed to say things I couldn't say to anyone else. His car was in the parking lot. Light glowed behind the curtains of his second-floor window. I climbed the creaking stairs and knocked on his door, and when he opened it, the expression on his face told me he'd been expecting this moment, that he'd been waiting for me to break down and come to him. We didn't say hello. We didn't make small talk. I walked into his apartment, and he closed the door behind me, and then I started talking, words pouring out of me like water from a broken dam. I told him about Evelyn's questions, about my inability to answer them. I told him about the sleepless nights, the way I'd been driving aimlessly through the city, the way I felt like I was living in a house that belonged to someone else. I told him about the fear that was eating me alive, fear of losing my family, fear of destroying everything I'd built, but also fear of spending the rest of my life pretending to be someone I wasn't. Adrian listened without interrupting, patient, and still in the way he'd always been when I needed to work through something complicated. When I finally ran out of words, when the confession had emptied me out completely, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me a question that changed everything. "Do you want to keep living a lie?" The words hit me like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. That's exactly what I'd been doing for years, maybe decades, living a lie so well-crafted and so complete that even I had believed it most of the time. I thought about my son, who barely spoke to me anymore. I thought about Evelyn, who had asked if I loved her and received silence instead of certainty. I thought about the years stretching ahead of me, more dinners where I nodded at appropriate moments, more nights lying awake next to someone I cared about but wasn't in love with, more mornings where I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger wearing my face. I thought about what it would cost to tell the truth, the conversations that would shatter hearts, the practical complications of untangling a shared life, the way our families would react, the way I would be seen by people who thought they knew me. But I also thought about what it would cost to keep lying. The slow death of authenticity, the gradual hardening of my heart into something that could perform love without feeling it, the waste of whatever time I had left on this earth. "No," I said finally, the word coming out rough and certain. "No, I don't want to keep living a lie." And for the first time in weeks, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe again. The suitcase sat by the front door for 3 days before I found the courage to pick it up. I had packed it in pieces over the course of a week, taking a few items at a time from our bedroom while Evelyn was at work and our son was at school. A couple of shirts from the back of the closet, the books from my nightstand that I'd never quite finished reading, the watch my father had given me when I graduated college. Not much, just enough to begin again somewhere else. The conversations had been as difficult as I'd imagined they would be. Worse, maybe, because there's no way to explain that you're leaving not because you don't love the people you're leaving, but because staying would slowly kill the parts of you that are capable of love at all. I told Evelyn first. On a Tuesday morning when our son had already left for school and the house held that particular quiet that comes with empty rooms and unfinished coffee cups. She sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of meals, thousands of conversations about ordinary things, grocery lists and vacation plans and parent-teacher conferences. Now we sat there, and I tried to find words for the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to me. I told her about Adrian, about the feelings I'd been carrying for longer than I'd realized, about the person I'd discovered I was underneath all the roles I'd been playing. I told her that I was gay, that I had probably always been gay, that I had loved her in every way I was capable of loving her, but that it hadn't been enough for either of us. She cried, of course, not the dramatic sobbing you see in movies, but the quiet, steady tears that come with the kind of grief that changes the shape of your life forever. She asked me questions I couldn't answer. How long had I known? Why hadn't I told her sooner? Whether any of our marriage had been real. I did my best to explain that all of it had been real, that my love for her had been genuine even if it hadn't been complete, that this wasn't about her being inadequate, but about me finally understanding who I actually was. The conversation with our son was different, more careful. He was 14, old enough to understand that his parents' marriage was ending, but young enough that the details of why seemed less important than the practical realities of what would happen next. Where would he live? Would we still do things together? Would I still help him with homework and come to his soccer games? I promised him that leaving his mother didn't mean leaving him, that discovering who I really was wouldn't change how much I loved him. I saw his confusion, his anger, the way he was trying to process information that probably felt like betrayal. But I also saw something else, a kind of recognition, maybe, that the distance between us over the past few years had finally found an explanation. The lawyers would handle the practical details, the division of assets, the custody arrangements, the careful untangling of a shared life. But before any of that could happen, before the legal machinery could begin its work, there was this moment in the kitchen with Evelyn, both of us sitting at the table where we'd planned our future and now were planning its dissolution. She had stopped crying by then, had moved into that practical mode I'd always admired about her. She was already thinking about logistics, how to tell her parents, whether to keep the house, how to explain to friends and neighbors that her husband had discovered he was gay at 33. "Do you love him?" she asked me, her voice steady but her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. "Yes," I said, and it was the first completely honest answer I'd given to a question about love in longer than I could remember. She nodded once, slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. "I hope he makes you happy," she said finally. "I hope this is worth what it's costing all of us." I didn't know how to tell her that it wasn't about happiness, exactly. It was about truth, about authenticity, about the choice between a comfortable lie and a difficult reality. I didn't know if Adrian would make me happy. We were stepping into territory neither of us had mapped before. But I knew that staying would slowly turn me into someone I couldn't recognize, someone who could perform the gestures of love without feeling them. The morning I finally picked up the suitcase, Evelyn was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded in front of her, staring at the surface as if she could read something important in the grain of the wood. She looked smaller than usual, more fragile, like someone bracing against a storm she could see coming but couldn't avoid. I removed my wedding ring, the gold band I'd worn for 11 years, the symbol of promises I'd made in good faith but couldn't keep, and placed it gently beside her teacup. The small sound it made against the wood seemed enormously loud in the quiet kitchen. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said, no words that could make this moment less painful or more necessary than it was. She didn't look up when I picked up the suitcase. She didn't say goodbye. But when I reached the door, I heard her take a shaky breath, and I knew she was crying again. Later, in Adrian's apartment, I stood by the window looking out at the city lights scattered across the darkness like scattered stars. Behind me, Adrian moved quietly through his small space, giving me room to breathe, to process, to begin understanding what it meant to be here, in this place, as myself for the first time in years. He didn't touch me, didn't try to comfort me or celebrate or make this moment about us instead of about the choice I'd just made. He simply existed in the room with me, patient and understanding, letting me feel whatever I needed to feel without trying to shape those feelings into something more manageable. The future stretched ahead of us, uncertain and terrifying, and full of possibilities I'd never let myself imagine. There would be difficult conversations with family members who thought they knew me. There would be legal proceedings and financial complications and 1,000 small ways that ending a marriage touches every corner of your life. There would be the challenge of learning how to love someone honestly after years of performing love out of obligation. But standing at that window, looking out at a city full of people living their own complicated lives, making their own impossible choices, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long I'd forgotten what it was like. I felt awake. Fully, painfully, wonderfully alive. For the first time in years, I took a deep breath that filled my lungs completely, that reached all the way down to the parts of myself I'd been holding in careful suspension. The exhale that followed felt like stepping across a threshold, like saying yes to a question I'd been afraid to ask. I was 33 years old, and I was finally ready to find out who I actually was.